this framing question. How can the few persuade the many? And for me, this idea is central to how movements can be successful. What are the key elements for that success? And it's also just a really fascinating idea to explore because it's not purely about democracy. In other words, the people who are doing the convincing aren't simply outnumbering those those who disagree with them to make the change. They are actively changing public opinion, often actively changing policy, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So on this slide, on the left, let's start with this image. You've got Lucy Burns, who was really the #2 in command of the newer, more militant wing of the American suffrage movement. Also known as the suffragettes. It's a term that was meant to be derogatory. I tend not to use it, but that's a way of distinguishing between two factions of the suffrage movement. And I would love this photo of Lucy because really she's just in a sea of men, and that was so common for all of the suffragists. And it's really a metaphor for this framing question that we're talking about here today. And so she's out on a soapbox. I think she's technically in the open topped car, but women stood on street corners, soapboxes, all throughout this phase of the suffrage movement, which was in the 19-teens. And these women were asking for one thing, and that was voting rights for women. In the middle here, you've got Ed Roberts. He is really the pioneer of the disability rights movement. This was him on the Berkeley College campus in 1962. He had been afflicted by polio as a child, and colleges and universities didn't allow people with disabilities to attend because they couldn't figure out how to accommodate their needs. But not only did Ed fight for those to have his needs met, but he opened up a whole dorm, a whole new way of inclusiveness on college campuses, which is pretty remarkable, especially if you think about how invisible people who were, bound by wheelchairs or people who, had difficulty getting around were. And so he made the disabled much more visible by integrating them into public life. And on the right here, you've got Minnie Jean Brown Trickey of the Little Rock Nine. This is such a horrifying and really stunning photograph. This is the day that she was one of the school children who was integrating Little Rock public schools. And, it's interesting to think that at this time in the 1960s, the Black population was only about 10% of America. And of course, for women, generally, in order to get any policies changed or to even get voting rights, they had to convince men who held virtually all of the elected offices to be on their side. So the first idea here is that a radical wing can bring energy and make the once extreme seem moderate. This is fairly common in social movements. I talked about the suffragists versus the suffragettes. Here you have Alice Paul on the left. She was the leader of this more militant suffrage movement. She was a Quaker from New Jersey, obviously the subject of my book. But she spent some time in England studying at a social justice organization that was part of her Quaker upbringing, and came in contact with the British suffrage movement that was also going in a militant direction. She came back to America and decided it was time for a whole new approach to the movement for voting rights for women. So women had been asking for voting rights all the way back to Seneca Falls some 60 years before, and they weren't making much progress. The women who had been active in the suffrage movement until Alice Paul came on the scene had really been taking a state-by-state approach, asking local governments for the right to vote, knowing that it would be very difficult to get a federal amendment. And Alice Paul said, well, that's not going to work because there are many states, especially those in the South, that will never allow women to vote. And that was very much due to racism. Alice Paul brought new energy, new ideas, new tactics to the movement. And it really inspired the other wing of the suffrage movement to re-energize itself. And they became almost in competition with each other. And while it was in some regard confusing for the public, like which group of suffragists are you supposed to follow, it ultimately brought more attention to the cause in a global way and helped move it forward and kind of bring it to a close, a successful win by 1920. Of course, for Malcolm X, what's really interesting here is that, Malcolm X stood for Black supremacy, Black empowerment, separation of Black and white Americans. He publicly criticized mainstream civil rights for its emphasis on nonviolence and racial integration. Whereas Martin Luther King may have thought that he had a dream, Malcolm X really saw a nightmare. But there's a new book out called The Sword and the Shield, which is a biography of Malcolm and Martin and their relationship. And it says that they were influenced by and inspired by each other. And they each knew what the other was doing and how it fit into the larger strategy. So again, it's interesting, even if they are working in tandem or they are working at opposing ways, that tension and energy really helps to lift the whole movement forward. Of course, youthful participants bring new ideas, energy, and tactics to movements as well. Alice Paul, whom I mentioned, was only 28 when she organized the first march ever in Washington. That was in 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated president. The students who are behind March for Our Lives, they're all high school students. Many of them are in college now. So again, another major youth movement happening around gun control. Of course, on the left, you've got Greta Thunberg. She's only 17 right now. She's been working on climate change for years. And, she was named Times Person of the Year last year. In terms of new tactics that she's brought to the cause, she created a climate strike for high school students. And of course, that had ripple effects for older people as well. And in terms of March for Our Lives, the students from Parkland, they've really been organizing around voter registration in key states and other fresh tactics, including, of course, marching and political organizing, trying to change policies at the local level. It's also interesting to think that John Lewis, the great civil rights activist, was only 23 when he was chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he helped organize the March on Washington in the 60s. Another important aspect for success is that these movements have a policy agenda. Obviously with the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act was the end result. They were very clearly focused on ending legalized segregation. So of course, not just protests for the sake of it. For voting rights for women, the suffrage movement, this is what was called their Great Demand banner that you see on the right. I mean, it could not be more clear what they wanted. They wanted an amendment to the Constitution to enfranchise women. They carried this in parades. They held this as banners in front of the White House as they picketed the president. And so having clarity around what you want that outcome to be was key. For the environmental movement, it was very much initially focused on clean water, and that led to the Clean Water Act and the Environmental Protection Agency. The gay rights movement eventually really focused on the AIDS crisis, and a more radical wing of that movement was ACT UP, and they really focused on testing, research, and treatment, and ultimately they won all three of those. The Parkland Agenda, which is part of the March for Our Lives student movement, they have 5 reforms that the Supreme Court says is compatible with the Second Amendment for gun control. So obviously it's too soon to tell whether they will be successful, but they certainly are taking a cue from other successful movements in the past. It is important to note that change often does start at the state level and then goes national. You know, and this is certainly true of the suffrage movement, where, you know, those early suffragists had this state level strategy, but it hit a brick wall at some point. And that's where Alice Paul came in and pushed for the federal amendment. But they did till the soil. You know, they had been out there for decades building a grassroots organization, and that can help change public opinion and also just change the general attitude among elected officials. Gay marriage is another interesting example of this, which started in Massachusetts and then Colorado, and then other states sort of piled on. So, and then it became national after that. So they also take a grassroots and grasstops approach. This is just one of the most amazing photographs I've ever seen, not just because John Lewis is staring at you so directly and intensely. It's unnerving almost. But it says, it's a very layered and fascinating picture. The man who's standing 2 people to the right of John Lewis, he's just to the left of JFK. He is A. Philip Randolph, and he was a Pullman Porter labor unionizer. And he went to, before this picture was taken, obviously, sometime before, he had a meeting with FDR. And he basically demanded of FDR that the military be desegregated, and also the defense industry generally had more, that there were, African Americans had more access to the defense industry. And FDR was really quite sort of taken aback that he brought this notion to the president, but he also knew that he was a powerful man at the head of this union, and that the railroads were quite important. And so what FDR said to him was, go out and take it to the country and make me do it. And so it's this idea that elected officials want and need that public opinion behind them. And so, you know, clearly A. Philip Randolph knew that he had to do both, and it wasn't just with FDR. He was also, you know, one of the key influencers behind MLK and a driving force behind the March on Washington. So here he is yet again in the White House telling JFK to, you know, to move forward with a Civil Rights Act. They also build coalitions, and allies give movements a moral authority. Here we have evangelicals standing with indigenous peoples over the Standing Rock, yes. So literally marching together. And, you know, there are other examples of this as well in the environmental movement. You know, you've got hunters and mothers working together to solve issues around pollution and land preservation as well. And they also leverage celebrity to amplify messages. I think we're probably quite used to this today. We live very much in a celebrity culture, but you know, this was a relatively new idea going back to the time of the civil rights movement. On the right, you've got Charlton Heston, James Baldwin, Marlon Brando, and Harry Belafonte. They all certainly brought their own messages and star power to the cause. On the left, it might be a little hard to see her at the podium, but that's Alyssa Milano, who was really a central figure in the Me Too movement, which was sort of begun by Tarana Burke, and it was Alyssa Milano's tweeting of the hashtag Me Too that really made that movement take off. And here she is in Washington a couple of years ago supporting the Equal Rights Amendment, which has really been a movement unto itself. Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment just a few years after the 19th Amendment was ratified. And she really, I think, expected it to pass in her lifetime. it has not, but it could very well pass in the coming year, depending on what happens with the next election. They also strategically deploy symbolism and dramatic tactics, but violence can alienate allies. The picture on the left, this is Jesse Helms's house, and ACT UP, the AIDS activist organization, basically put a condom on his house. So poor Jesse made front page headlines across America. I'm assuming he wasn't home this day. PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, had a whole campaign where they threw red paint on fur coats. I think that was really, it was an effective strategy that made women decide that they, did not want to be subjected to that, and really changed the culture around wearing fur. Activists during the civil rights movement chose Selma because they knew that its police chief would attack the protesters and that there would be TV and still photographers there to capture the acts of violence against them. Today, of course, we've got viral videos of police shootings, which obviously rally people to the issue. But there is data that shows that violence alienates allies. I recently listened to a really fascinating talk by a political scientist down at Princeton named Omar Wasso, and he used many different data points that he plotted against various movements over many, many decades in America, and basically came to the conclusion that extreme tactics, especially violence committed by protesters, can lead to negative press and the falling away of allies. Low-level violence can create urgency, but the question is, where is the tipping point? At what point is it too much violence and you start to lose the public? Successful movements also embrace new communications tactics. The Silent Sentinels, these were a group of picketers in front of the White House who were part of the militant wing of the suffrage movement during the 19-teens. They held protest signs, knowing in front of the White House, knowing that there would be photographers there to capture the image, and the words on their picket signs were the message that they were trying to share. Of course, it was the heyday of newspapers. Also, Alice Paul created her own newspaper when mainstream press ridiculed the movement. And so she was able to create this sort of propaganda organ that was also a fundraising tool for subscribers nationwide. The civil rights movement, of course, was stagecrafted for television. And it's interesting to think that the first Earth Day had a grant to support an 800 number to organize. That really sounds ancient, but it was cutting edge technology at the time. Obviously social media has changed the game on many facets of movements, going back to the Arab Spring, and of course, the Me Too movement, and now Black Lives Matter. The Women's March, going back to the winter of 2017, they used Slack, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a really fascinating piece of software that can have massive numbers of people collaborate on one platform on different channels. So for the Sister March aspect of the Women's March that happened then, it was sort of, so the Women's March was what happened in Washington, and then there was an additional strategy to ensure that there was a march in each of the 50 states, and then it ended up blossoming onto every continent. And you can actually see here women who organized in Antarctica. The Women's March, in addition to using Slack, also used a mapping website to encourage local organizers to see if there was a march near them, and if not, that they could create one. And the Sister March organization provided a whole toolkit, a digital toolkit that was sort of plug and play for them to scale up a march really quickly, because many of these organizers were first timers and had no idea what they were doing. But 5 million people turned out. on that day all over the globe, and it was the largest peaceful protest in the history of the planet. On the right here, you've got Naomi Osaka, obviously using her celebrity and knowing that TV cameras are going to be on her, wearing masks from Black Lives Matter. These are all names of Black men who were killed by police. And if you are on social media and you're interested, the Sunrise Movement, which is sort of the movement behind the Green New Deal, they have, so much of their strategy is tied up in Instagram. So it's interesting to follow along and see what some of the messages are that they are pushing out. Every movement builds upon previous tactics as well. And in many ways, it's true that history builds upon itself too. Starting on the left, these are the silent sentinels I was mentioning, the suffragists who were picketing in front of the White House. They had this idea to hold these signs and stand there as pickets because they were inspired by the labor movement, which was a sort of really a new thing during this time in history. This was known as the progressive movement. And it was a time when women were organizing for suffrage. The labor movement created the AFL-CIO, and the NAACP was also formed at this time. So there was really a lot of social tumult, and the suffragists really were able to use a lot of the best tactics to get attention. Of course, I mentioned that the suffragists also organized the first ever march in Washington in 1913. And then you can see that the civil rights movement here in the middle for the March on Washington just took it to a whole other level in 1963. And then, of course, the civil rights movement inspired the anti-war movement starting in 1964. And then on the right, you've got the United Farm Workers also going on strike and marching. They took the strike in a new direction around consumer boycotts. So it's another way of sort of going grassroots and then grasstops as well. Earth Day was inspired by the student anti-war protests, and on and on. Ultimately, though, really what everyone wants in a social movement is cultural change. It's important to have the policy change, support the structure, and provide, the legal support that's necessary. But really what movements want is mass acceptance. And I think it's really interesting to think about gay marriage as a place to start. The gay rights movement is a fantastic example of just massive social, policy, and cultural change in recent times. For example, Karl Rove used opposition to gay marriage to help George W. Bush get reelected in 2004. And then Biden used pro-gay marriage to support their reelection in 2012. And that was a pretty dramatic swing in public opinion in just 8 years. And it's a way of showing that if you get the framing right around your messaging, that you can really move public opinion. Their narrative, the way the narrative changed, it's sort of initially proponents were asking for rights, and then they shifted to saying, love is love, and that we love each other, people have a right to love each other, and that really did move popular opinion in their favor. Of course, Harvey Milk had, sort of laid the groundwork for the gay rights movement many decades before gay marriage became a thing. But it is a great example of how cultural change is possible. Just as a reminder, same-sex marriage expanded from 1 state in 2004 to all 50 states by 2015. So that's a pretty big shift. Occupy Wall Street is interesting. They certainly raised public awareness around income inequality and certainly renewed interest in socialism. It's debatable whether they have had any, clear policy change, but I think that since Occupy, there have been many more really progressive, probably, you could even call them socialists, democratic socialists, who have been much more out there running for office and even being elected. The Me Too movement is really fascinating because while there wasn't really any specific policy outcome, like at a federal level, corporations have embraced changes where, they're insisting that boards have to have a certain percentage of women on them, that their leadership has to be a certain percentage of leadership. But really, it's about women now feeling empowered to call out bad behavior. The environmental movement is also interesting to think about the cultural change aspect there. Obviously, we got the Clean Water Act and the environmental protection agencies, and there's tons of regulations that have been put into effect, but it's almost become a status symbol to sort of show your outward embrace of environmentalism, whether it's from, buying a Tesla or recycling. And the disabled rights movement, ultimately that movement culminated in the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it was really about inclusion. And I think the conversation today about inclusion has gone to a place where it was really probably unfathomable just a few years ago. Here you have a disabled trans model who was on the cover of a magazine. So that's real cultural change there as well. And of course, even with the Black Lives Matter movement, now you've got, the National Football League and all of sports really getting involved. And once it's at that level of, popular sports and culture, that it has really seeped into the public consciousness. So I think that this slide in particular is somewhat chilling and really important to discuss. This idea that mass movements can change the world and influence elections, that's great. Tactics definitely matter. I'll use Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon as a cautionary tale. The Watts Rebellion of 1965 really led to a backlash, again, because there was violence, there was damage to property. Again, this had to do with police brutality in a Black community. And the backlash to that led to the election of Ronald Reagan as governor of California in 1966. And ultimately that paved the way for him to become president and also helped push forward this whole conservative revolution that is in some ways still going on. But it also affected the Humphrey-Nixon election in 1968. So, Humphrey was the author of the Civil Rights Act, and he opposed Vietnam and really supported the student protests that were going on across America. But ultimately, when those protests turned violent, he was blamed for that unrest and ultimately lost the election to Nixon, who launched the war on drugs. And of course, we're still living with the after effects on that. So, as someone who writes about history all the time, it's fascinating to think about how pendulum swings affect behavior, public opinion, whom we vote for, and whether movements can be successful. It's interesting to think about where we might be on the pendulum swing right now. Are we really close to hitting the apex with the amount of protest that's happening? Again, there's this very fine line between if a movement has some violence in it, is that a good thing to draw attention and to really crystallize and solidify some support and send this message that there's tremendous urgency? Where is the tipping point for when you start to push potential allies away? So I think that there's a big debate happening right now, and I think that both the behavior out there in the world and public reaction to it very much could influence the election in November at the presidential election. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions and would love to hear your thoughts. And I will stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other.
All right, and I just want to say that I am going to continue recording, so it's up to you whether you want to appear when you ask your question. We very much welcome that, but if you're feeling shy or private, you can just keep your camera off when you ask, and you can also type it into the chat box.
So maybe if I could start with a question. And it's good to see you again, Tina. Thank you for coming to this tonight.
Thanks for having me.
I was really fascinated by the different examples that you gave of how movements gain momentum. And, you know, I'm often accused of narrowing things too much. And so I generally think that when people come forward with their message, it seems to be either a moral message or a financial message. And I guess what I was intrigued by in your examples is that there are lots of ways that people can organize others to contribute to a cause. At the same time, and I guess in that regard, it would seem like the more reasons you have to bring people forward, the merrier. But your last point about the importance of tactics really matters. I'm wondering at what point does that become too diffuse? And do causes generally have to sort of push away maybe secondary or tiers of motivation that the members might think are important to just crystallize around a single theme?
Well, it's interesting to think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so what is, you know, my day job, so much of my day job as a chief marketing officer is about messaging and what you can say to influence people. You know, and for me, I mean, it's how can I get you to watch PBS? It's not, I'm not trying to sell you stuff, right? I'm trying to sell you history and educational programming. But my point is that really you need a good story and you need it to have an emotional connection. You know, what's really fascinating, you see this in the environmental movement, that facts don't always move people. You can have a list of data points, but if you are not, you know, really tugging at someone's heartstrings, they may not be moved, even if they understand it, you know, like logically. You know, I think we probably all remember that famous ad from the 1970s about like littering, and there was a Native American man who had a tear streaming down his eye. I mean, that's sort of, you know, he didn't even have to say anything. You immediately felt guilty if you had ever littered.
Ironized Cody. I even remember his name because of that ad.
But there you go. So it really is about the emotional connection that you can make with people, and that bringing them into the fold. Once they're there, you have to do some really bad things to push them away. You know, that's the hard work, is getting them into the fold in the first place. So, I mean, you make a good point about, you know, can a movement be too diffuse? Can you have too many messages? I think that's partly why Occupy Wall Street wasn't a sort of resounding success. There wasn't a specific reform that they were voicing. You know, there was a lot of anger about the 1%. I think we are now in a moment where we're actually talking about, you know, the 1%, which is great. You know, but how do we solve for that? Do we have to elect a socialist to the White House in order to achieve that? Are there other policy levels? Are we as a culture ready for that? You know, so it's really interesting. I think ultimately that's why Occupy failed in some regards, because it was diffuse. Nobody really knew what they were trying to achieve.
You know, your point about emotional connection is well taken. I've been to Washington, D.C. multiple times to speak to policymakers. My background, I'm a biomedical scientist. And even though I walk in there with all of these facts and figures, the people who always host those events say, tell stories.
Yeah.
They want to hear stories, and it really does
Exactly.
make an impact to put a face with an issue instead of just saying, well, these are the percentages. This is a pie chart.
Absolutely. So important. I see there's a question in here from Han about protest songs of the 60s, and if there's any research about how effective that was. I don't know if there's research, but I think that the fact that we can probably all sing some of those protest songs tells you that it was effective. And, you know, music is interesting because it is both reflective of the culture and also influences the culture. And so I think there's this interesting feedback loop that can happen there. You know, I've had a lot of people ask where the protest songs are of this moment. I think rap has been the protest songs for a long time, you know, definitely more than a decade now. And if you think about how that has influenced really the youngest generation who grew up really listening to nothing but rap, you know, I have 3 white sons, and I can tell you that so much of their perception about social justice in the world has come from listening to rap music. You know, we live in Brookline. We're not faced with we have a fairly privileged existence. We're not faced with these issues on a daily basis. But music has really shaped how they view the world in that regard, and so music is very powerful. And I think it gets to music can be both personal. And it also creates memories. I think it's a lot like, you know, food or, you know, like a perfume that someone wore. It's a real sensory experience. And so your body just kind of absorbs it and you process that information in a different way on a different level. So it can be incredibly powerful. I don't know if there's any research on it, but now I'm curious. That would be fascinating.
There's another part to that or a different question in the chat from Han. Why do you think Colin Kaepernick's protest took so long to take hold?
Well, I think that it was it was the first real sort of public protest on a platform like that. And I think the reason why it took so long for it to take hold was because of, it was a demographic issue. I mean, if you look at who watches football and how football is marketed, you know, there's a lot of, there are military flyovers and they're singing the national anthem. And, you know, it's not necessarily a demographic who's going to be initially empathetic to that cause. And so I think it's taken a really long, obviously, it's taken a really long time. I mean, if he had done that protest in other forums, it's hard to think about what those might be. You know, it might have been received differently, but that's the part of protest that I think a lot of people perhaps gloss over. It's supposed to get your attention. It's supposed to create conversation. It's supposed to become a national outcry. I mean, it had the absolute effect of what he meant to do. And we have been talking about it for 4 years now. Like I feel like the taking a knee thing hasn't really gone away at all. And that's amazing from something that one man did. You know, I mean, it's a shame that his career has been sidelined, but I think that his legacy will be so much bigger than, you know, what his football stats could have shown.
You know, it's interesting that you say the part about it being unfortunate for his career, Tina, because I'm also remembering something that you said earlier about why Selma was chosen. Mm-hmm. Because they knew that the chief of police would come after them, and that the people who were there knew that, and they had to know that they were exposing themselves to suffering. I've also heard Brian Stevenson say that it's really important that you be willing to become very proximal to difficulty in order to make a difference. And so I think that Colin Kaepernick certainly knows the NFL better than any of us on the call, and he had to have known that it was going to cost him in one way or another, and yet he did it, which is a tribute to his bravery as well as his dedication.
It's so true. It's while I mean, and the platform. I mean, there really isn't a much bigger platform than a football game on a Sunday afternoon. But I think that there's a lesson there for all of us. Like, we all have a platform, whether it's just in our own families or on our streets or communities or whatever groups that we are a part of. I think it's how many people use social media today. That is their platform. There's always something that we can do as individuals to make a contribution to something that we care about. So, just because we don't play football doesn't mean that we can't make a difference. I mean, the Women's March was a really great example of that. It was just about showing up, right? And making sure that, for people who marched that day, it was about making sure that there were more women who protested than people who showed up for the Trump inauguration. I mean, that was the ultimate goal. And that happened by many factors.
There's a question in the chat from Susan.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on how we can engage young people, younger than voting age, in the voting and election process, especially in this major election year?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's already happening. There were many, organizations focused on high schoolers. Certainly, the Parkland students have been focused on, high school age turnout. There has been a tremendous amount of work done at the grassroots level over the last 4 years to register people to vote, and that is almost always focused, at the 18-year-old age. But these groups are also kind of bringing kids younger than that into the fold to say, like, you might not be able to vote, but you can still volunteer and help, and kind of making them part of the pipeline, and also just creating a new generation of activists who like understand how to do this. That's what the Greta Thunberg's school strike for climate. There were elementary school kids who were doing that, and if you are politically engaged on an issue, it will translate into votes. So it's hard to imagine that kids who care that much about the climate won't register and vote when they're 18. It's definitely happening. One thing that all of us can do, if you have kids or grandkids or friends with kids, is bring them with you when you vote and talk about it and show them how to do it, and just make it seem like the obvious thing that you have to do when there's an election.
I have a question or a thought that maybe you can expand on, and that is about the pace of change as it relates to the media. And I'm thinking that women's suffrage and the ERA they moved at a fairly glacial pace. The ERA, we're still waiting 100 some years later, but or about 100 years later. But some of these movements picked up steam a lot faster. And I know there are lots of factors, but I'm thinking about, like, going back to the protest songs that Han was talking about. Those were being played on the radio. That was popular music of the youth. And at the same time, television was broadcasting graphic images of soldiers and civilians being hurt. And then I'm thinking about Me Too, which exploded over some traditional media. The New Yorker magazine played a big role in that movement, but really it caught fire with Twitter and other social media posts. And then Black Lives Matter got off to a semi-slow start for the first few years, but with the video of George Floyd's death, and with the spread on social media of discussions about it, it just picked up so quickly. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about social media, other forms of media, and whether that is an accelerator.
Yes, I mean, social media is absolutely an accelerator. I think people were shocked at the way Twitter facilitated the Arab Spring, right? A lot of people didn't see that coming. I think that while I also think that social media as an accelerant can seem deceiving, there are usually lots of other factors happening in culture, in the news, that has already kind of laid this foundation. It's just like the match on the gasoline. And so, you know, for me too, for example, over the last 10 years, there has been kind of a reawakening around women's rights, especially women at work, you know, paid family leave, all kinds of conversations happening within the business world about, you know, how women were hitting glass ceilings and so forth. So that conversation was renewed. There's also a generational aspect there too. I mean, we talked about youth movements and the suffrage movement. There was a great banner that I loved that said "The young are at the gates," and I think about that all the time because you know, millennials, who are now almost the largest cohort in the workforce, are just saying, "Hey, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. You know, we're not being treated the way we expected," and they're impatient. And they're, you know, making demands that, you know, maybe second wave of feminists were sort of exhausted by. So, you know, but social media, there's no question that it's fascinating. I do think that the thing that we've never really seen before are, you know, these videos of police brutality. This is definitely a relatively new thing, and you can't not see it once you've seen it. And so, you know, I think that while racism has been part of this country for 400 years, and yes, the Civil Rights Act passed in the 60s, there still have been so much, there's been so much that hasn't been dealt with, right? But when you see a video like that, it kind of just brings it all to the fore. You know, there's, one thing that's worth thinking through is that what is the specific policy agenda of Black Lives Matter right now? It tends to be focusing on this idea of defending the police. And to get back to, you know, Willie's point about messaging, I think that as a movement, it needs to really make sure that people are understanding what that means, or else they could lose support over that. While they might have support around ending racism and police violence, that specific policy outcome might be more difficult to achieve. But who knows? If we keep seeing videos like this, it's anything is possible.
I couldn't unmute myself there for a minute. Tina, were you responding to Gina's question about the Occupy movement being too diffuse and Black Lives Matter? Is that, you were just picking up on that?
I saw it as soon as I stopped speaking,
okay.
But hopefully I addressed your thoughts, Gina.
And then, yeah, Gina, feel free to chime in if you want something more specific. But there was an earlier discussion about, kind of in the chat, not directed at you, Tina, but when Susan had asked what young people could do to be involved in elections, Han had said, try being a poll worker to make it safer for older poll workers who might be more susceptible to COVID. Kathleen says, I am one of those older poll workers, and in Reading, there is a shortage of poll workers this year because of COVID, so younger people are welcome and encouraged to do that work.
That's great.
And then
got to get that message out.
Yeah, I didn't know you could still, I thought it was too late, but that's fantastic that it's not. And we are holding early elections again at the library. It went well. We did it safely, I think, for the primaries. So you can hand deliver your ballots, you can mail your ballots, you can come to the library and vote early, but come vote. So we're moving on to the next one. It's Stephanie. She says, how do we hold/balance the imperfections of some of these leaders who are now being scrutinized beyond their core platform, particularly with the lens of structural racism? Alice Paul, Sierra Club separating itself from the legacy of John Muir, Planned Parenthood from Margaret Sanger. So in other words, you know, how do we go back and evaluate these historical figures who come up lacking in our ideas of justice now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's definitely one that I've talked about a lot this year. You know, I think for Alice Paul in particular, she was both, she said things that were racist and she also wasn't anti-racist. And I think that it creates cognitive dissonance for people to be able to hold those two things together when thinking about one person. You know, with Muir, you know, I think that there were, was it comments about Native peoples? I know that there's a new biography out about him that sort of explores this, but it often, you know, comes down to something that they said or a thing that they did. And it's important to look at those and to judge it, even in retrospect. I think it's also important to say, you know, ultimately, was this person working to be a racist or were they working to not be a racist? And so, you know, people can, movements are messy, people are imperfect, leaders can be complex. And I think we just have to kind of hold it all together and say, yeah, a person can be all of this. I mean, specifically for Alice Paul, the thing that's really fascinating to me is that in many ways, the only way Black women were gonna get the vote was if they passed a federal amendment, because the South was never gonna allow voting because, you know, because of the African-American population was so large. And so white men wanted to keep the power there. So by pushing a federal amendment explicitly to push voting into the South was like one of the most anti-racist things that she could have done. She did make comments specifically around like a South Carolina ratification that, you know, were clearly racist. White men would say, you know, well, if I do this, then, you know, all of these Black people are going to get the vote and, you know, that would be wrong. And so she kind of fed into that and said, oh, you know, well, don't worry about that. Just pass the amendment. So was that being politically expedient? Did she really believe those statements? Did she say them? Yes, she did. We don't have more details around that provide the context, but you know, number one, we don't have to make excuses for it. We don't have to extrapolate. We can just say, these are the facts we know. We also know she did these other things too. Yeah, I mean, we certainly hold leaders of a movement to account, especially today more than ever. I think it's part of this process that we're going through of reevaluating history and knowing that we haven't told history in a straight way in the past. So I think that's just part of a process that we're going through right now. I also think, you know, it wasn't just up to Alice Paul to fix racism. It's up to all of us. Like, what have any of us done to help solve for racism? I think we have to ask ourselves that every day. And so, you know, yeah, you can ask what she did and you can hold her account for saying or doing things that might have been racist, but she explicitly said that wasn't her job. And you can falter for that as well. You know, so it's very complicated. But I think that's what makes it interesting to go and look at historical figures and try to, you know, look at the different layers of the onion there.
Gina has a follow-up. I'm trying to remember what you had in your book about the Black women in the march. They ended up marching with their colleges, didn't they? And did Alice Paul intervene in one way or another at that point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for those who maybe haven't read the book, Alice Paul in 2 months organized this suffrage march in Washington. And she reached out to African-American women to come and participate in the march. She was public about it. And many college sororities, Black college sororities, answered the call. In fact, a really famous sorority was created explicitly so that their sisters could march. That was the Deltas. And so when word got out that she had invited African-American women to participate, there was, definitely a group of other suffragists who said, hey, wait, this, number one, I don't want to march with Black women. Number two, if we do have an integrated march, this could turn into a race riot, because there were many people who had come up from the South to celebrate the fact that Woodrow Wilson was elected as the first man from the South to be president since Reconstruction. So there was definitely a racist vibe happening in Washington at that time. But all of America was racist. I mean, let's be honest, this wasn't specific to suffragists. They were just a slice of the culture at that time. So there was trouble on the day of the march. Alice Paul said, okay, fine, I won't invite any more Black women, but she never explicitly disinvited anybody. And she was more passive aggressive about it. And so Black women showed up and they did march, and they marched in, some of them marched in their rightful sections. There was one group that was told to march at the back. But it was, a chaotic scene in many ways. And, again, in terms of context, a march was a very radical thing. It devolved into chaos anyway, because the men who were there for the inauguration sort of stormed the path. And women didn't even march down the street by themselves or walk down the street by themselves. Women were typically accompanied. And so now you're throwing a third element of radicalism, which was an integrated march at a time when segregation was a very real thing. And it was a tinderbox. So you can fault Alice Paul for not standing up more forcefully to tell these suffragists who were balking, these white women who were balking, no, I'm sorry, but this is going to be an integrated march. I think it's also worth anyone here to say, what would I have done in that situation? Would I have been, afraid for being responsible for people's safety? Could I have understood the complexities of racism and why it was essential that Black women marched in an integrated way? Just really challenging to think about all the ways that could have gone down and how one person was responsible for that. So if any of you were involved in the Women's March, whether it was here in Greater Boston or in Washington, what a chaotic scene that is. And it's difficult to know where's the head of the line, where's the back of the line. Is someone pushing over there? Am I going to be safe? And it was similarly a scary situation during the suffrage procession as well. And race was absolutely an aspect of that. So it's okay to have opinions about, how people behaved a century ago. It's okay to hold them to a very high standard. I think if we're going to do that, we also need to do the same things for ourselves and ask ourselves, what have we done for better or worse to change the world?
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Do we have time for one more? So thinking about the Occupy Wall Street comments that you made, and to contrast that, we talked about Colin Kaepernick, who lost his livelihood. Alice Paul, who, from your fabulous last presentation, went on a hunger strike and did other things. And then, of course, all the way through people who lost their lives in Parkland, Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez. And when I look to Occupy Wall Street, I sort of ask myself the question, does a movement need martyrs to be successful?
Mm-hmm. Well, you can have, it's tragic if a movement has to have a martyr to be successful. I'll just say that first and foremost. But I think a movement does need leadership. Whether that leader becomes a martyr or not is sort of a separate issue. Occupy did not have a leader, right? And I would say Black Lives Matter did not have a leader for, the early years of its existence. That was by default. It meant to be a diffuse movement, somewhat underground. You could never figure out who was in charge, and And that was by design. That has changed recently. They're becoming more organized, better funded. You know, you can actually on occasion see their leadership on the Sunday talk shows on TV. And so, you know, it's maybe a maturing of the Black Lives Matter movement. Maybe it's just, you know, means that it's being successful and attracting real leadership, solidifying that. The thing I'll say about martyrs is that it just obviously gets a lot of attention and then generates a lot of sympathy. And sympathy, going back to that idea of the emotional connection that a movement has on someone, is really powerful and important. What you don't want to have happen is that the sympathy ends up being with the state that is preventing a movement from being successful. And where that sympathy tends to turn is if, you know, protest movements get super violent. And Gina says, it can be dangerous to have a leader. Look what happened to MLK. And I read that the government infiltrated the civil rights movement and fomented internal disagreements. Yeah, it can be dangerous. I mean, leadership is a really scary thing. So we should also be grateful for our leaders.
And take it on ourselves when necessary.
You can all do something.
All right, well, you all have been a thoughtful audience. Thank you so much for all your contributions. And Tina, again, it's just been lovely to work with you and scheme on this for the last year plus. And thanks for coming along for the ride.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you all tonight. Thanks a lot. Don't forget to vote.
Everybody, give Tina your hand and vote. Go vote.
Back at you. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.